A very good morning to everyone who's joining us via Zoom today. Maybe we'll give it about 30 seconds for participants to enter the Zoom call at the moment. We seem to have about 32 participants so far. Okay. My name is Gregory Ho. I'm a research associate at the Khazanah Research Institute, focusing on poverty, housing, and urban development. It is my pleasure to be your moderator for today, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone who is joining us for our webinar, Preventing Urban Slums in Malaysia. But before we begin the webinar, I'd like to take 2 or 3 minutes to introduce KRI, as well as our panel of speakers for today. The Khazanah Research Institute is a policy-based think tank that carries out research on pressing issues of the nation. We are a not-for-profit organization that was incorporated in 2014 that is funded by Yayasan Hasanah. Over the past 9 years or so, since inception, we have published a number of reports with the hope that our research might address pressing issues of the nation and contribute to the common good. We have a wide array of researchers specializing on different fields ranging from poverty, housing, social protection, digitalization, labor market studies, as well as more recently on climate policy. However, today's discussion will focus primarily on the issue of housing standards in the context of preventing the formation of urban slums. Much of what we will be discussing today stems from our report titled Decent Shelter for the Urban Poor that was recently launched about four months ago. So for your convenience, we have included the QR code right in the middle of the slide so that you can access the digital copy of that report. The itinerary of our webinar is as follows. In the next 40 minutes or so, the team of researchers involved in producing this report will be giving a presentation of our research findings. Together with myself, I'm happy to introduce the team. To my left, Diba, Marjan, and Adam. Dr. Suraya Ismail, our lead researcher for this project, will join us for the Q&A session that would take place after our presentation. Throughout this presentation, if you have any questions that you would like to pose to us, feel free to leave them in the Q&A box down in the Zoom function or in the comments segment of Facebook. And with that, let us begin our webinar. I'd like to begin this webinar with a very, very basic question. What is an urban slum? Probably you would be imagining something that looks like the picture on the right. UN Habitat actually outlines the characteristics of slums as follows. A slum household is a group of individuals living under the same roof in an urban area who lack one or more of the following characteristics: access to safe water in sufficient amounts at an affordable price, access to adequate sanitation in the form of private or public toilet shared by a reasonable number of people, sufficient living space, by that they mean not more than 3 people sharing the same bedroom, durable housing that protects against extreme climate conditions, security of tenure so that one is not forcefully evicted. In essence, a slum is basically housing that is of a substandard quality that exposes its residents to some various form of deprivation, either physically by not having access to basic necessities like water or electricity or something else, or being in a hazardous living condition, or perhaps the resident in a slum has to deal with uncertainty or the risk of being homeless one day. And of course, there are also other various contingent issues such as crime, social exclusion, or even disease outbreaks, which are correlated with the incidence of slum, for example. So how do urban slums form? The main factor that drives the formation of slums are rapid urban population expansion. This is normally triggered by a combination of rural to urban migration and natural growth that is coupled with the lack of housing options that are generally affordable. It often starts with the formation of informal settlements as squatters erect housing that sometimes without the formal permission of landowners, and often with materials and building standards that is not in line with local building codes. And with that, maybe I would like to pose the first question to Diba. Could you give us an overview of the historical antecedents behind Malaysia's approach to managing and the formation of slums?
Okay, thank you, Greg. So I would like to start with looking back at the housing policies over the years. Housing provision have changed in tandem with our social and economic trends. So it started with the development of public low-cost housing projects and government quarters, and then with the implementation of new economic policy and industrialization, as explained by Greg, we were experiencing rapid urbanization rate. A lot of people were moving to the urban areas, thus increasing the infrastructure needs in urban areas, including the need for housing. There was urban overcrowding, a shortage of affordable housing options. Not all migrants who migrated to urban areas were able to acquire a decent job with decent income. So many people were resorting to substandard housing such as squatter settlements. Concurrently, a lot of urban development projects were going on. Land was contested for housing and also for other commercial users. So government's approach in preventing the creation of urban slums was to address the proliferation of squatter settlements by introducing the zero squatters policy, which is to eliminate squatter settlements by setting a target year of 2005. So squatters were relocated to the newly built public housing projects like PPR, whereby these tenants will rent the PPR units temporarily until they have achieved a certain financial status that enable them to buy or rent in the market sector. And gradually, the objective of PPR program has moved away from being a transit home to now appears to be a major solution to tackle high housing unaffordability issue, particularly for urban poor and vulnerable groups, along with the existing affordable housing programs like Prima or Rumah Wib. So that was a brief overview of housing policies in the past decades. Now I'll be moving to briefly explain the development of Program Perumahan Rakyat PPR, our main case study in the report. So before PPR, public sector was engaged in the development of low-cost housing projects. They were the primary provider. But we noticed that in the 1980s, private sector began to replace the public sector. This is also in line with the requirement of the 30% low-cost housing quota imposed on private sector. Then in the 1990s, we saw the shift towards the strata housing from landed properties, and this was mainly due to rising land costs. And there was also a strengthening of social rented sector as home ownership, which was the main government's agenda in almost every Malaysia plans back then. It was not a feasible option to squatters because they are unable to afford to buy the low-cost housing programs. So that's also the main reason why squatter settlements came in. So with PPR, then they were relocated to the social housing. Then in 2000s, we saw a reshaping of new PPR policy. So prior to 2002, there were two separate programs called PAKR, Perumahan Aman Kos Rendah, and Program Perumahan Rakyat Bersepadu that were merged and rebranded in 2002 as PPR Dimiliki Dasar Baru and PPR Disewa Dasar Baru. So PPR Dimiliki is for ownership sold at below market rent from 35,000 to 42,000 ringgit. And PPR Disewa is for rental with a subsidized rental fee of 124 ringgit per month. So the PPR projects are usually developed by federal government, who is responsible for the project design, tendering, and construction. Then once the construction is completed, the project is handed over to the state government to handle the management, like selecting the tenants, collecting the fee, and also handling the maintenance. and PPRs were opened for ownership in 2009. This indicates that highly subsidized PPR rental rates may not be sustainable in the long run without substantial increments.
So in the past, there were efforts to relocate squatter settlements into public housing. In your opinion, do you think that public housing today is at risk of developing slum-like characteristics?
So that was also our objective to conduct our study, was to find out actually what are the key issues in the living experiences of PPR residents and also the management of the sector. And yes, our study found out that PPRs are increasingly dilapidated. And yes, they are at risk of turning into urban slums if proper action is not being taken, particularly if maintenance are not being done properly. Although it appeared that PPR has successfully achieved its original objective, providing housing for residents from squatter settlements, but there are several issues that hinder it from becoming livable, and our study has identified two of those issues, which are poor standards and maintenance. So the first issue, which is the management and maintenance of social housing. So construction and management of social housing are handled by two different entities. As I mentioned before, federal governments build the PPR, while the state government and local councils handle the maintenance, and this is a case of a moral hazard in terms of financial risk. So when the capital cost is low because of using a poor quality materials or design during the construction stage, then maintenance cost will be higher due to frequent repairs. And state governments and local governments might face constraints in affording the high maintenance and rectification costs for PPR buildings. So, which all of this costs they may not have budgeted before. So there is a misalignment of financial incentives between the federal government and the state government. And we also found that building standards of PPR is lower compared to other housing options in the market and are likely to be, and it only provides one gross floor area for each unit. And for example, a single person household and a two-person household living in a 3-bedroom unit, which means that PPR unit is being underutilized. So in a case that PPR unit is being overutilized and underutilized, so GFA one-size-fits-all approach may lead to inefficient use of space. And this is why countries in Singapore have multiple GFAs to accommodate for different household sizes. So are PPR units following a good quality standards? So we also compared the PPR standards to minimum standards recommended in National Housing Standard 2019 for a similar housing type of 3-bedroom unit. And the table shows the comparison, and the diagram on the right shows the layout of a typical PPR unit in KL. We have to take note that the existing PPR units were designed based on the then acceptable design and standard specification outlined in the National Housing Standard for low-cost housing flats in 1998. So comparing it with the 2019 standards, we found that PPR standards are inadequate, not meeting the 2019 requirements, particularly in room sizes, kitchen, drying, and utility area. So the issue here is that Malaysian housing standards focus has always been on building and construction specifications for new dwellings. The standards do not outline guidelines as a benchmark to upgrade the existing quality, to upgrade the quality of existing stocks like currently for PPR, and nor does it define suitable occupancy levels in tackling the overcrowding issue. So one may also ask what happens to households when they live in such poor quality housing environments. I would like to bring your attention to the vicious habitability pyramid by linking the habitability pyramid to home environment. So where households achieve the optimal satisfaction and well-being when they meet the basic physical comfort, functional comfort, and psychological comfort. So in the case of PPR residents, they may not be experiencing the optimal physical comfort, as we found units are not meeting the minimum standards. So residents for especially those who are bigger families will need to live in overcrowded conditions, and then there'll be lack of privacy, and some may not achieve the functional comfort, as some have children who will need additional space for study area. And then some may also face emotional stress, as we have seen during the pandemic years, when most of us were stuck in our house, were trapped for many months, and you just imagine they are being stuck in the 650 square meter of housing unit and nowhere else to go. And there are also additional risks to health and safety, like spread of diseases due to high density and overcrowding, poor qualities and standards also risking the safety. And we have seen numerous headlines in the newspapers, such as lift breakdowns and household items are being thrown down from higher levels of PPR floors. So now we have talked about how poor standards can be a contributing factor, along with poor maintenance, for PPR becoming at risk of turning into slums. So the next two slides, we will discuss what are the acceptable standards and what are the tools that we can use to achieve this. So the agreed minimum standard sets the baseline for housing quality. So any housing above this standard, which we may call as a decent housing standard, is the only form of housing acceptable. So decent housing should provide adequate shelter to household and have no negative externalities such as crime and health issues. Thus, there are no absolute housing standards. Different countries have different housing standards that are set based on their social norms and what seems to be culturally appropriate for them. So some countries use different floor area measurements, like some use gross floor area, some use living space or a usable floor space. For example, India have unit specification by income group. Like for low income groups, they have 28 to 48 square meter house. And for high income groups, over 80 square meter house. China follows household sizes, like 50 square meter unit for 2 to 3 person households and 65 square meter unit for households with more than 4%. Similarly, for UK have occupancy guidelines for GFAs. So international organizations such as ILO, United Nations, WHO, and inhabit have developed principles of adequate, decent, and healthy housing. And this includes how units to have sufficient living space, access to basic needs, basic amenities, adequate lighting and ventilation, and not located in slum or hazardous areas or areas without refuse disposal. There are several instruments that available to create good quality standards. For example, we can use scientific physical environment analysis, which helps in assessing the suitability of housing location. Then we have building maintenance costs, which gives estimates on the durability and housing quality. And then we have resident satisfaction surveys, which gathers feedback from residents on existing housing conditions. And this serves as a base for improvements in standards and design. And then we have post-occupancy evaluation, which provides insights into the usability and functionality of housing units. All of these will lead to better design housing complexes through a continuous improvement of building standards, like feedback from satisfaction surveys or maintenance and building performance reports can be incorporated in early designs for continuous upgrades of standards. Some of these tools also can identify if particular building will need to go through the last stage, phase 4, which is building transformation, like whether it is cost effective for refurbishment or better to be demolished. So user satisfaction survey is an important tool. And it's being widely used across countries like UK with English Housing Survey and US American Housing Survey, which suggests why their standards have always been improved and also provided with a multiple GFAs. This is partly why we did our survey also, to understand the issues that PPR residents face and measure their satisfaction in terms of units, complex, and surrounding amenities. And housing design parameters should not only focus on individual unit, but also to include shared spaces and neighborhood amenities, and also incorporating the local population social norms and cultural habits to better understand the parameters involved in creating decent living conditions. I would like to stop my presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepa, for the historical overview and a very comprehensive description of how standards ought to be set. As a reminder for our audience, if there are any questions that you would like to pose to us, you can do so via the Q&A box via Zoom or on the comments section in Facebook. I'd like to pose the next question to Marjan. Could you describe for us what are the living conditions of the PPR residents, and perhaps what are some of their pain points when it comes to their housing experience?
All right. So thanks, Greg. So before I go into the pain points of the residents, maybe I'll talk a little bit about the user satisfaction survey that Tiba spoke about. So, for our webinar, so we are talking about preventing urban slums. So how exactly do you do that? So at first, you have to start with having a good housing standard. And one way to have a good housing standard is via having a user satisfaction survey. So it has many names. It could be a residential satisfaction survey or a housing satisfaction survey. But the idea of a survey is to actually get feedback from the residents of what they feel, what they think about their current housing environment, to make sure that the house is actually good for them to have a decent life. So what is the purpose of satisfaction survey, right? So broadly from literature, there's 4. So one is it could be a predictor of an individual's perception of their general quality of life on whether or not it's okay. Second, it could be an indicator of residential mobility, meaning that if you're not happy with your house, then you're more likely to move away, for example. Third, it could be an evaluative measure of the housing development or whether or not you're overall happy with the housing program. And number 4, it could be an assessment of residents' perception of the inadequacies of the housing environment. So what they like or don't like about the house, and that could be an indicator for private or public housing environment, private or public housing investment on where they can channel those investment efforts. So basically, for KRI, we actually did a user satisfaction survey or residential satisfaction survey. So we went to 5 PPRs, so 4 in Kuala Lumpur and 1 in Pulau Pinang, where we interviewed around 3,800 households, right? So in our survey, we asked 2 aspects. So one is on the unit and complex, and thirdly is the location of their socio-economic activities. So how far is the PPR that they're currently residing to, like places of work, places of school, their families and friends, for example. So before I touch a bit on the pain point of the residents, I think it'll be a good idea to know who exactly are the people residing in this PPR. So when we went them and asked, we found that most of them are long-term residents. So it means that they've stayed in the PPR for quite a long time. So more than 80% have lived there for more than 5 years. A lot of them are around 8 to 10 years that they've lived in PPRs. And as Tiba has mentioned before, so PPR started off as a rental program, but eventually they opened up for ownership. But from what we see is that more than half of the residents are renters. And those in Penang are fully rental, right? And then we actually asked them on their background, on their history before they went into the PPR. And we found that many of them used to live in landed properties, and a lot of them came from squatter houses and long houses. So this is actually, you remember when Tiba spoke about the origins of PPR. So we see this coming in. And while the original intention of the PPR is to provide housing from those coming from squatter settlements, we do see them helping a lot of the urban poor, where we see more than 60% of households living in PPR actually earn below the poverty line income of 2,208, right? So before this, Tiba has talked in depth about the standards of PPR, right? But what exactly is the link between standards and the livability of the residents living in the PPR? So one thing that we need to remember is that the reason we have standards is to make sure that the housing environment meet the needs of the residents living inside the PPR. So let's say, for example, we found that the average household size of people living in PPR is around 4.5. So it means families living there around 4 people, 5 people, 6 people. So but at the same time, we do know that the PPR units offered to those 2 families wanting to move in PPR, so it's a 3-bedroom per unit. So for bigger families, like Tiba has mentioned, it could be overcrowded, and smaller families could be underoccupied. And when we see those living inside PPRs, a lot of them are families. Many are nucleus families, meaning mom and dad living with kids. But we also see around 20% or more of extended families living in PPR. So it means mom and dad with kids, but also grandparents living inside PPR. So this raises the need of like multiple gross floor area, different type of layouts for different type of households living in PPR. So, when we talk about PPR, people usually think, oh, maybe there's a lot of like the elderly living inside PPR, but we actually see a mix of both. So around 1 in 10 of residents living there are aged above 60, but around 1 in 5 are children. So you need to make sure that you have that physical environment actually meet the needs of the people. So for example, do they have enough playgrounds for the kids to play and the likes? We do see when we ask the residents, another thing that we found was that 1 in 10 of households have at least one member with disabilities. So again, this raises the question of whether or not the infrastructure is able to accommodate people with disabilities. For example, when we look at the PPRs in KL, so the first unit actually start at the first floor, not at the ground floor. So it means anyone with a wheelchair or those with with mobility issues would have problems going up the stairs if, for example, in the case of emergency where you can't use the lift, right? So, and when we looked at the household size and we compare it with the number of bedrooms available, we found that around 14% of households experiencing overcrowding, which means that more than 2% per 1 bedroom. And if we account for gender, so let's say, for example, you don't want your sons and your daughters to live in the same bedroom, then that increases to 20% of overcrowding. So what does this mean when we talk about the profile, right? So before this, Greg asked on the pain point of the residents. So we did ask them in our survey. We asked how satisfied are you overall with the PPR, as well as specific aspects of the PPR. So in general, what we found was that residents are generally satisfied with the PPRs. So a lot of them reported 6 out of 7, so somewhat satisfied with their PPRs. This could be surprising because, we heard like horror stories of like, PPRs are bad, yada, yada, yada. But when we look at international literatures of satisfaction on public housing, it seems that this is not really a surprise because people who live in public housing tend to report higher satisfaction, because sometimes you might fear retaliation when you say the otherwise. But but then again, when we ask the residents, it seems that they're more happy with the unit compared to the complex. So I would like to bring your attention to the table on the right. So those are specific environmental factors that we ask on whether or not they're satisfied or not. So the bluer the color, so the more satisfied, the grayer the color, the less satisfied they are. So here you can see for the unit aspects, they reported less satisfaction with shared spaces, for example. So you remember earlier on, Tiba spoke about the PPR units, the standards are not up to par in terms of like the kitchen, the utility area. So now you can really see it in terms of their satisfaction. They reported that these are the things that they're not as happy about. Then when we asked them on their satisfaction of the complex, again, so certain issues crept up. So for example, aspects related to floor sensitivity. So for example, the condition of the lifts, the number of lifts, the condition of the stairs. So the higher you are, so the more dissatisfied you are if these things is not done well. The location of the refuse chamber, so the tempat pembuangan sampah. So the higher you are, so you have to like go down and go to the refuse chamber to throw your rubbish. And we also see other issues, for example, issues of safety and security, as well as shared spaces. So when we ask them, like, what are the top issues? One of it is inadequate parking, for example. So I think I'll stop there and I'll pass to Greg.
Thank you, Marjan. So in a way, the residential satisfaction survey can be thought of as a means to sort of identify what residents are satisfied with, but also what they are most unhappy with. But also, in addition to that, as an input for what can be done to improve their living conditions, right? So I guess I'd like to pose the next question to Adam. What are some of the policy recommendations that we have recommended in this study to improve the lives of the people?
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, so as explained by Marjan and Tiba, there are certainly livability issues with PPRs that we observe that in turn translate into some level of dissatisfaction among residents. So if you want to ensure decent living among the current as well as future PPR residents, we have proposed some long-term policy solutions to rectify the structural and management issues that we believe are causing these livability concerns. And the principle of these recommendations is viewing social housing as a management responsibility rather than merely a construction solution that seeks to maximize the number of units built, for example, without any care of how they are maintained or managed afterwards. But another key principle is also viewing social housing within a framework that aims to enable these PPR residents to graduate outside of these PPRs or the social sector into the private market when they do improve their financial standing. And this is particularly for places that are dense, particularly urban areas like KL and Penang, where we do see that there is a lack of land that has led to the proliferation of stratified and dense buildings, but at maintenance costs which are quite excessive. So in other words, we do see social housing and PPRs ideally as something that should not be a permanent housing solution for a household. Rather, it should be something more of a transit home. And it is the private market that we believe should be the one that caters to most of housing demand in Malaysia. It is quite unrealistic to expect the government, either the federal or state governments, to be the one building enough homes for most of our population, because doing so, it's unlikely that they would be able to meet the quantity of demand or even the quality that is in line with what we expect, because their resources will likely be spread thin. So with these principles in mind, we have proposed 3 management trusts encompassing 9 recommendations. So the first trust relates to the management of PPR households or residents. And the goal of this is to ensure that the poor and vulnerable in Malaysia, they are not neglected and left without any shelter, while those who we think have a bit of a stronger financial position, they are assisted to graduate out of the social sector into the private market. The second trust is the management of PPR units or the buildings. And this is to safeguard the livability of existing as well as new PPR housing, which also meets the specific and various needs of residents, as explained by Marjan. The third trust is to do with the management of private housing stock. And this is to enable the PPR residents who are better off to graduate into housing options that suit their needs as well as their budget without making them worse off. So I'd like to dive deeper into the second management trust on PPR units because it is more directly related to the topic of today on standards and livability. We'll discuss Trust 1 and Trust 3 at a later webinar. So the first recommendation under the second trust relates to existing PPR units and buildings, and that is to refurbish them in order to improve livability. So firstly, this is to increase the GFA or the unit sizes to follow a good quality housing standard. Secondly is to introduce multiple GFAs or unit sizes to accommodate the different household sizes and profiles that we see among the PPR residents. And this is so that large extended families, for example, they could get a bigger unit, while a smaller family, for example, a couple with no children, perhaps they could get a small unit. So ultimately, this is to avoid any overcrowding and underuse of space. The third kind of objective is to cater for old age and physical disabilities in the design of units as well as the complexes. So for example, the toilets, perhaps they should be large enough, as well as include railings, ramps around the complexes, as well as ground floor units. As many of the PPRs we surveyed, actually all the PPR surveyed, the KL PPRs we surveyed, they do not have ground units. So providing these is important because Marjan has highlighted that a considerable number of the PPR residents are either of old age or disabled. The fourth solution is to improve public spaces as well as amenities. So the fifth objective is also very important as it informs how the first four should be done. And that is to include a participatory process consisting of user satisfaction surveys, like what we did at KL and Penang, as well as building condition surveys by technical professionals. And these should be used as inputs to decide on what exactly needs to be improved. Is it, for example, the number of lifts or the quality of lifts, or maybe the corridors or the staircases? These kind of things will be informed by those two things. And also by what extent. For example, like the specific unit size, what exactly is, by how much should it be increased, for example. And of course, this is ultimately to ensure that the needs of the residents are met. But also, of course, it's important that these refurbishments come at a reasonable maintenance cost. The second recommendation seems like a rather controversial one, and that is to demolish the existing PPR buildings. But this is only if we find that the maintenance and upgrading costs are too excessive. And to come to this decision, building audits are key to assess the structural soundness of PPRs. And also, we must also consider what are the costs to build and maintain the new PPRs in place of the demolished PPRs, as well as what is the cost to relocate residents. So for this, it's important to design with life cycle costing parameters. And as a definition, life cycle costing is a way of estimating the costs needed to properly sustain or maintain a building throughout its entire lifetime, from construction all the way until its end, where they may be needed for demolition. So following this, building condition surveys must also be done, similar to building audits, ideally at regular intervals to monitor and ensure that these buildings are performing and functioning the way that we need them to. The third relates to new and upcoming PPR housing. And just like the existing PPRs, you want these new PPRs to be of a good standard that meets a certain level of livability. So of course, firstly, this has to do with raising the minimum standard or the sizes, the GFAs, so that they are aligned with the minimum standards for the private housing market. There should be no difference. Again, new PPRs should also have multiple GFAs, cater for old age and physical disabilities, and also have better public spaces and amenities. And again, when it comes to deciding what exactly needs to be done, we need to have a participatory process of based on user satisfaction surveys, as well as building condition surveys. And over here, I'd like to also add that early on, when we design these PPRs, we need to institutionalize a continuous process for the improvement of standards in the building development process, so that when it comes to the future, when these new PPRs become old, there's a clear pathway for them to be improved in line with our, as we as a country develop and our living expectations increase. The fourth recommendation is to align the financial incentives between builders and maintainers, particularly when it comes to building these new PPRs. So as Tiba mentioned, those who build is the federal government. They're the one who build or at least provide the capital costs, while it is the state government or the local councils who are responsible for maintenance. And this clearly poses a moral hazard, as capital costs could be reduced, but at the expense of higher maintenance for the local councils to manage. So to address this, life cycle costing, as I mentioned, is important and should be adopted, because only then would the cost of construction and maintenance be transparent for both parties, and therefore a better balance could be struck between capital costs and maintenance. So I'd like to discuss a bit more about maintenance costs. So typically maintenance fees for a given apartment complex, at least at the private sector, they will be calculated by dividing the gross operational expenditure by the total number of units. And this gross operational expenditure closely relates with the number and types of facilities available at the complex. And using this method, one study did estimate that the monthly maintenance cost for a PPR should be around 210 ringgit. But this is likely to be an underestimation because one, it's from 2012, but also there may be other factors that may not have been accounted for. So this is where the building condition survey, as well as the life cycle costing parameters, are important, because they would estimate the true cost of maintenance, particularly over the entire life cycle of the building. So in the case of PPRs, maintenance is funded by the rents that local councils collect from the residents, so which is at a rate of around 124 ringgit. So this is clearly not enough to cover the maintenance costs. So with such a gap, there are a few solutions that could be considered. The first is a rather direct solution of just raising the rents to a level that is enough to cover the maintenance. But of course, this is rather unpopular and difficult to enforce, especially given that it deviates from the original policy objective of providing shelter for the poor. The second is a public-private partnership where the private sector and NGOs, they could pool funds as part of their CSR to fund maintenance. The third is just to simply go with the status quo and do nothing. But of course, this would mean that both the residents and local councils would face the risk of building dilapidation, and this may result in future unforeseen repairs, which may become urgent, but also come at exorbitant costs. And we must also not forget that there are also social costs to the residents if we neglect their living conditions, as I think Tiba explained quite in detail. And also there is a risk of these PPRs turning into urban slums, which we do not want. The last is, as I mentioned, is to demolish the buildings. But again, this should be based on the costing exercise as informed by the life cycle costing parameters, as well as the building condition surveys, where in case that we find that the cost to maintain or refurbish would actually drain the resources for local councils in the long run. So to tie in all our objectives that I explained to raise the housing standards of PPRs, both old and new, I like to bring back the framework that Tiba mentioned, and that is a framework for continuous improvements, which consists of the 4 phases from early design, construction, building and use, and finally building transformation. So in the early design phase, it's important that it begins with the collection of inputs from user satisfaction surveys and building condition surveys based on the prior experiences of other residents. And this is ultimately to create a positive living condition that satisfies the specific needs of households, but also that could be maintained at reasonable costs. And after the early design phase, the decisions based on the life cycle costing parameters, they should be followed through during the construction and into the building in use phase. And the continuous improvement of housing standards will arise from this interplay between building and use as well as early design. And it is a iterative process which would be achieved through the use of satisfaction surveys and building condition surveys. And again, these standards must be updated regularly as our living expectations increase. And then finally, a building would go into a stage of building transformation more often than not. And here a decision must be made whether to refurbish, add, or to demolish, depending on the estimated costs as informed by the life cycle costing parameters and building audits. So with that, I'll end my sharing here and pass back to Greg.
Thank you, Adam, for outlining the various instruments under this framework so that we can work through these issues before any intervention is made. To our audience, I'd like to thank you for asking all these questions. Do keep these questions coming in. But before that, now I'd like to invite Dr. Suraya, our lead researcher for this project, to give some concluding remarks and perhaps elaborate on what are some of the things that can be done, either to remedy existing ailments or to prevent our public housing from developing these slum-like characteristics.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you so much for the introduction and having this. We are very proud in KRI to be giving this webinar session on one of the main thrusts of this report. But I think, I hope, was quite clear from our presentation just now that what we are proposing is a new paradigm shift. We are proposing new standards for Malaysia based on the existing, what's realities on the ground, which is using user satisfaction surveys, which is basically the voices of the poor being put into a design cycle that Adam mentioned just now. So this is a new paradigm shift, because one might say that why are we making so much effort to help the poor? But we must understand this, that PPRs are essentially a problem of poverty, giving shelter to people in poverty, as well as economically vulnerable, which is the reason they migrated to urban centers for a decent life, which is what Tiba mentioned. Now, if within this strata, we can't give them decent shelter, there will be homelessness. This myth of coming to cities will not be realized because the city can't give decent shelter at the prices they can go into, and therefore government comes into this group. Now, I've seen some of the questions here, but I'd like to say here as well that now, in order to have this new method that we are proposing, it must mean that it's a targeted method to the poor. So you can't be housing 40% or 80% of population. That means the B40 demarcation is wrong. So based on our report, please do read it. Some of the answers are there. If you do targeting in terms of who should be in social housing, which is PPR, or low-cost housing, which is those for the poor and vulnerable, it should be about 18–20% of every state. It should not be until 40%. Now, the rest will be catered by the private sector offerings. This is the affordable market. Ours is a social market. So this is what we're trying to explain as well, that there's a hugely different policy responses for the social sector and the affordable private sector offerings. That's mindset change number one. Mindset change number two is that when we are doing PPR construction programs, it must not be just a construction output. We will build 5,000 PPR units and your problems will be solved. No, it is a management issue by the government, because we are handling people who are economically vulnerable. So there must be a management task rather than a construction solution of just outputs. So that's the second paradigm shift. And thirdly, I'm going to just speak about, and this is my last one, about the design parameters, because the user satisfaction has shown that people in PPR are a bit dissatisfied with the personal spaces in the personal spaces in the units and shared spaces in the units, meaning places where they sleep or places where they congregate as a family is still not sufficiently adequate for them. So wouldn't it be great if the standards reflect this? We do look into design parameters that ensure the personal spaces and the shared spaces in the units are given different types of permutation in terms of design, because this is what people want. So I think one of the real issues is that the third line of policy options that we should, I think, embrace is ensuring that at each unit, as well as the amenities, is done in such a way that is adequate for the number of people staying there, which means we should look into density as well. High density in the unit or high density as a complex will only increase maintenance costs. So we must have that balance in terms of understanding what is that optimal unit for us to build in terms of stratified building. I think I shall stop there, Greg. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Soraya, for concluding our presentation. I think now we will be moving into a time of question and answer. But for your convenience, we have placed this slide, this QR code for you so that you can have access to a digital copy of our report. We may be making reference to the report when answering your questions. Okay, so let's start the Q&A. We've gotten the first question from Mohammad Raihan. Given that rising costs on construction and pressure for developer to cut costs, how would we deliver the good standard when budget is also undergoing supercut across all sections?
Can I answer? Yes. Okay, so I'll go first. I'm sure my colleagues want to say more about this. But let me just bring this question to the area of focus for today's conversation. As I mentioned before, when we actually want to help the poor, it's normally about 20% of population. So when the government don't build that many units, those funds will be concentrated on less units rather than more. When you concentrate on less units, you can invest in good building standards. And we must understand that good materials and good standards, of course, currently construction cost is going down. When these buildings were built, it wasn't that high. So it begs the question then, why weren't good building materials were executed for these buildings? But having said that, so we look for the future. Having said that, strategy one, to my mind, humbly, we should concentrate on less units being built, but with the higher standards, because this is investment for the long term. Investment for the long term, meaning that this is government asset, and assets of the government, if concentrated and built to the higher standard of that time, and improve over time as well, will bring higher returns on society. So we must understand the social sector is about returns to society. Now, for developers, I mean, for us, because we are looking into social housing in in densified cities, this area is under social housing and therefore is under government. And this is not under the emblem of private sector. Now, one might want to say as well, if cost is rising, how do we deliver good standard? But think of the counterfactual. If cost is rising, you are going to be, developers as well, going to build substandard housing, and you're passing the cost of maintenance to your purchasers. Now, this will also reduces the trust that purchasers have to the developers, which is the construction industry on the whole. So what are we trying to build here? We are also trying to build trust that the housing industry will build decent housing standards for all of society. Now, if this is not something that we can hope for or trust from our housing industry, then the whole system will collapse. So I think this is important to look at. What is the counterfactual of us not able to design or build good, decent buildings for Malaysians? This is quite an existentialist question, but it needs to be addressed because you can't cut corners because we are in Malaysia, because most countries do not cut corners when it comes to building standards.
If I can just add to that, from my view, I guess there's a few things that we have to that there is to address with this question. And from my reading of this question, it seems to relate mainly to the role of private developers in providing shelter for the poor. And I guess currently private developers do have to adhere to this quota of about 30% of the development has to be catered to the low cost sector. And in a separate report and an upcoming webinar, we'll discuss this a bit more. But essentially, this quota, I think perhaps it should be revisited by all the state governments because there is an issue of cross subsidization and as where some of the requirements to build low cost housing is to build them at a very cheap price. And this is, of course, quite difficult, no doubt, for developers to meet, and they would have to cross-subsidize from their other projects, their main projects, which actually would also inflate the prices of that. At least this is what they say. So perhaps this quota should be revisited. They should either increase the price of these low-cost housing so that developers can also build at a better quality, or it should be discontinued altogether. Because we also must consider should those who are not doing too well, should they be owning homes, or should they actually be taken care of by governments in the social sector? Because what we see also from our other study is that these privately managed low-cost housing, they are actually they're managed in a less better way than what we see in PPRs. And they have a higher risk of being dilapidated. So as Dr. Suraya mentioned, it's a risk that we do not actually want to end up with. Therefore, like this quota thing, we should really be revisited. And also, I guess we also have to a second thing that I alluded to is this demarcation between the social sector and the private market. And really, if those who are really poor and vulnerable, we should be trying to lead them to the social sector and PPRs rather than forcing them into ownership of low-cost housing in the private market.
I'd like to contribute a little bit to this discussion, also to sort of add on to both Dr. Suraya and Adam's point. The housing demand for the poor is something that we will always have, and is something that the federal government would always have to invest funds in order to ensure that the people's core housing demand needs are sort of satisfied. I guess it's always a contentious issue when we discuss the use of federal funds, but given how the objective in the past was somewhat different than the situation that we see today. The objective of the past is that we needed this public housing to sort of address the issue of squatters and informal settlements. But today our goal is more of using this. It's not as if we can reset the situation that we are in and start from a clean slate. So we are here today and we see that these are the issues at hand. So we just have to make a decision on what should be done in public housing, either to improve the situation that people are in, or if we do nothing, then perhaps we might be kicking the can down the road. And we would have to deal with these problems at a future point in time at perhaps risks and face risks that are maybe higher to a larger number of people. Okay. Do you guys have anything else? Okay, let's move on to the next question, I suppose. This is by an anonymous attendee. You mentioned that PPR tenants reported high satisfaction with their units. Could it be because they were relocated from informal settlements?
Okay, maybe I'll take that. So, so the question is whether or not they're more satisfied because they came from informal settlements. Firstly, you have to remember that even though they came from informal settlements, we're not clear on what is the quality of the settlement before they move into the PPR. So in our survey, we actually asked the residents, what is your previous housing experience, whether you came from a landed housing, what type, and we also asked the size. So it's not necessarily where they came from exactly, but what we do find is that if you came from a smaller house prior to moving into a PPR, then of course you're more likely to be satisfied. So it's not really because they came from an informal settlement, but rather it's the previous housing experience. If it was a bad housing experience coming to a better one for the PPR, then yes, they're more likely to be happy. Maybe we can go to the next one.
Okay.
That one, the national housing standard, one size fits all standard. Do we have different standard?
I can answer that. So according to CIDB's National Housing Standard 2019, so they have recommended three GFAs for three types of housing with different numbers of bedroom units. So like, for example, a unit with one bedroom. So the GFA should be more than 600 square feet. For a unit with two bedrooms, the GFA should be more than 600 units and 600 square feet, and also for three bedrooms, more than 800 square feet. So that's why we compared our PPR study with the third specification, which is for 800 square feet unit with three bedrooms. So for the second part of the question, do we have different standard for different composition of household size? No, we don't have that. And for different type of families, recently we found that there is a guideline, just a guideline, not set as a standard in the CIDB affordable housing design. So saying that a nuclear family maybe should have 1 or 2 bedroom. And for extended family, maybe should have 3 or 4 bedrooms. But this is not mentioned in our National Housing Standard guidelines.
Okay, thank you, Deepa. So for the next question, by Feng Tian Yong, relating to the cultural habit, civic mindedness, in relation to the maintenance of PPR, is there any survey done to gauge the residents' level of sense of ownership, in particular the rampant vandalization of lifts and other M&E facilities such as firefighting posts, or sense of belonging, I guess sense of belonging / sense of ownership?
Okay, maybe I'll take that one and people can add on to it. So for our survey, we didn't specifically ask on the sense of ownership, but what we did was we actually went to meet the Residents Association and we asked how exactly do they do things around in the PPR. So how did they handle maintenance? How do they do their community programs? So what we do find is that if residents are given more, okay, so maybe a caveat there. So it actually depends on the PPR community. So some community, they cuci tangan, like they don't want to be involved too much because they have a lot of things going on. But some community, for example, the one that we went to Penang, they were quite tight-knit. They wanted more involvement in the decisions regarding the PPR. So for example, when the local authority wanted to repaint the PPR, so what color? So even then it was, they actually asked and the residents were allowed to vote. So what color do they want to repaint their PPR? Another thing, for example, in just simple things like hiring cleaners. So rather than hiring from someone outside the PPR, so they hired residents within it. So they have this sense of ownership that I'm taking care of my house, I'm taking care of my community, and at the same time, what funny thing happened was the residents actually marah dia punya anak-anak yang buang sampah, because you know that your fellow neighbor is cleaning your PPR, so you don't want to menyusahkan your neighbor too much. So it's that sense of like community where we help one another, and this is our house, and we want to have a say. So that you can do it, you can create that sense of ownership by giving residents a say in how they want to handle their PPR.
Just to briefly add, I think the PPR in Penang was one of the success factors with these community-led initiatives is that these residents associations, which I believe are informally formed, they are made up or composed of a diverse set of people. You know, you have the youth, the elders, for example, and I think that's very important.
And yeah, I would like to also add that in our study, we found that community-led initiatives, like when some programs or some initiatives are led by community, then the programs are more welcomed. And so when the community have like the sense of belonging, right? It's my PPR, my complex. So like Adam said, a diverse group of members. So they will be more be careful in maintaining their complexes.
Okay, and on to our next question. But before that, if anyone who has asked the question before, and if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to post them as well. Yeah. Okay, for our next question, how much would it cost to refurbish the PPRs, and where's the money going to come from? Would there be better use of federal funds?
So we would not have the estimates on how much does it cost to refurbish the PPR. So that's why we are suggesting to have the life cycle costing approach, where we can estimate the cost from the construction stage to the last stage of like refurbishment or demolition stage. So I believe the estimate should be with the local authorities. So we do not have that. And where's the money coming from? Usually the maintenance costs are taken by state governments. So federal government's responsibility is to complete the construction and hand it over to state government. So the maintenance fees are mostly from state governments. And that's why sometimes because of poor standards, a poor quality, when maintenance cost is higher, they do not have the sufficient budget to take up the additional maintenance expenses. And also they do receive some budgets from the federal government in our annual budgets, like for example, some allocation to repair major maintenance expenses like lift repairs. So we do have that, and we also have the Tabung Penyelenggaraan Perubahan, where local authorities can get allocations from those funds.
Thank you, Tiba. So it appears that there are multiple ways in which this can be done. But I guess the reason why we do not quote one figure in terms of how much it will cost to refurbish the PPRs is because they are not all the same. Not all PPRs are homogeneous. And what we have done in our study was to provide a framework in thinking about what are the necessary parameters and the inputs that you have to investigate first before you undertake something like refurbishment or even demolition.
Yeah, if I can add, firstly, the funds can come from the local councils themselves, but of course, they are typically quite strapped for cash. So what they can do is some of the measures that I did list, like for example, raising rents. But of course, that's quite unpopular. So another, perhaps a better way is to get the funds from the federal government. I mean, right now we do already have those existing tabung. So it is just a matter of the federal government injecting more money. And really, I think if people say that it is an issue of the federal government is also strapped for cash, I think this is something that should be challenged, because ultimately, whether you are strapped for cash really is just a matter of priority. I mean, social housing should be a priority of the federal government, and it should be the focus for them when it comes to housing, and they should not try to spread their resources too thin in trying to build affordable homes for the rest of the population, in a way to make up for the market failures in the private market. Yeah.
Okay. Another question from an anonymous attendee: isn't the real problem with enforcement, and is action being taken against tenants who default on payments?
Can I answer this? So I think one of the ways in which we want to think about management of PPR households is that it is a case of managing the household. So enforcement would come under that. But when we want to manage households who are in poverty or who need social assistance, sometimes there are reasons why they default on payments. It is because sometimes you don't get a job. Most of them have unsecured job employment. They're in the informal sector, in the gig sector. So sometimes people do fall within those cracks. Now, of course, when you take it as enforcement and management, you would have a database as what we have mentioned in our book, and you would know the characteristics of each household. And you look at it as a sense of social responsibility. When you look at things as a social responsibility, you can not just do enforcement, or you didn't pay, therefore off you go, but in terms of understanding why they are in that situation. Is it a real genuine case? Or is it, yes, memang they are defaulting? Clearly, if it's defaulting, then go ahead, you can take stern action. But if it is a case of the economy vulnerable issues, then I think other social assistance could come in. And that was the other reason that we wanted this to be part of a social assistance program as well, where if we do have problems in terms of paying rent, then some other housing coupons would come in and help, because this is what other countries have done as well. So I think when we start having that paradigm shift, looking at this as social assistance, then enforcement and management of household come together.
Can I also add to that discussion? I think that as Dr. Sri has mentioned, this is public housing or social housing that we are considering, and local enforcers have to sort of like balance between sort of determining or identifying households who are perhaps gaming the system, and maybe in that case you want to take enforcement. But for the rest of households in PPRs, it is the case that they face deprivations of many kinds, and they may not have enough income. And we have to go back to the original idea of having public housing in the first place, which is to satisfy a core housing need. If we were to be a bit too stringent on enforcement, there will be indirect consequences that result, perhaps that would manifest in the incidence of rising homelessness in Malaysia. So I think we should, yes, maybe there's a problem with enforcement, but we must consider this as a balancing act, as well as more thorough and proper investigation before real action is taken in a sense.
Also, I think even if everyone does pay, as I mentioned earlier, the current rental rates, they're too low to be able to cover the true maintenance costs of PPRs, and which may be very high, given that perhaps some shortcuts were taken during the construction and design phase.
Okay, perhaps we'll move to our next question by an anonymous attendee. Is there any comparable best practices from neighboring ASEAN countries in terms of managing urban public housing?
Yes, I can take that question. So even in our study, we have give examples of Singapore with the management of their HDB flats. So what they do is that they conduct a tenant review tenant review every 2 years. So means every 2 years they'll be reviewing their tenants' eligibility criteria, like reviewing their income. Are they still meeting the income eligibility criteria for HDB flats? So if they exit, then they will be asked to like look into other options like buying HDB flats. And also what HDB management does is that they update their HDB residents database, like update their demography, family sizes, income data, so to see that whether they still like fit in the fit in renting or how much of housing would they need in the future. So when they compare it with their local population analysis, also to track on the future demand and supply. And then in terms of like management wise, they have several programs like home upgrade, home improvement programs, main upgrading program, and neighborhood renewal program. So targeted at like once the building has reached 30 years, for example, then they will look at like what are the common facilities that need improvement. Then they have several rounds like 30 years, 60 years. And then those who have reached more than 70 years, then they go refurbish the building. So this is what we are lacking in Malaysia. So yes, so this is the one of the comparison that we did in our study.
Thank you, Tiba. Okay, for our next question, how do you determine if one should graduate from PPR? And what is your view of the supply landscape of private sectors providing housing that is still affordable enough for people who are ready to transition from PPR housing? As we are aware, affordable properties these days are usually outside of the city areas and often come with poor connectivity, potentially becoming a burden for those who have moved.
Okay. I can answer that. Oh, the question gone already. Okay. So what is the criteria? Like, how do we know like one is eligible to graduate from social housing? So in our study, you can refer to our chapter 5. We have come up with this basic needs approach. So once which we also anchor it to household size. So once a certain household already meeting or living above basic needs approach, so we assume that they are eligible or they have achieved a certain financial capacity to move into the private sector. So in our study, we identified that 26% of residents have potential to graduate. But why are they not moving into private sector? Why are they still staying in PPR? So that one of the reasons is the unaffordability in the private sector market. So we also did a collaboration study with InSpan. We did a market rental study, which showed that rental rates are far more expensive than what is being offered in social housing. So if, let's say, I want to migrate to private sector, I have to accept 2 to 7 times more of the rental fee that I'm currently paying. So that for some people, maybe it's too much. So that's why they are not migrating into the private sector. And if I have the option to buy, so most of the affordable housing options, which we took the median multiple affordability indicator, 3 times your median household income. So most of the options are limited to flats, apartments, and clusters. And we also found out that most of them are smaller than PPR unit size. So they will be better off staying in PPR unit rather than moving into my private sector. So this is also one of the reasons, and also one of the main reasons why private developer also should play their part to like provide affordable options in the market sector that enables the social housing social housing tenants to graduate from social renting to private sector, and then from renting to eventually achieve the asset accumulation. So if you can look in one of the diagram we have on building and enabling policy framework, also taken from our earlier report on rethinking housing.
If I can just add to what Tiba is saying, because I think this is a very focal point in our discussion. That is why we are going for national housing standards today. Because if you have such disparity in terms of standard from, say, social sector and the private sector, even private sector to social sector pricing. Because if you can see the trend now, units are getting smaller, but prices are going higher. So for normal nucleus 4.5, that means 5, 6, 7 types of household, to migrate to a 1 bedroom, just 600 square foot is not feasible. Though they term it as affordable housing in the private sector. So I think this is where it is a whole of nation approach that we must look into, so that we maintain standards at both sectors.
And I would also like to add that there was also one part on like how affordable housing options are located far away. So in our study, we also found out that the relocation of these people, tenants, should be within the vicinity of the current PPR location. So because in our spatial analysis, we found out that the relocation had created a good impact in terms that they weren't displaced far away from their workplaces or schools or amenities. So we have to ensure that if they want to migrate or to private sector, it should be within their current location.
We did analysis in that way to ensure that relocation does not displace your household from their existing socio-economic structures. So if you're already attending school in certain areas, you do not want your relocation to affect that.
Thanks.
Okay, so the next question is, how can urban planning and architecture can be leveraged to create sustainable urban environments that prevent or reduce slum formation?
Can I take this?
Sure.
So I think coming from my master's was in the Bartlett School, UCL Architecture. No way in any textbook that we will create, urban slums. No way in any textbook we will create cities not habitable for human beings, planning for the people. I mean, it's all in the textbook solution. But reality is, the property rights issue, who owns the city, and how do we legislate the city that more resources or more land goes into making the city accessible to the poor as well as the middle range income and the affluent. This is the contestation of spaces. So the answer to that is, yes, you have all these things that we want to do, and I totally support that this could be done if you look at some of the methods being adopted in textbook. But mind you, in architecture and urban planning and even the professional courses, practice is theory and theory is practice, because it's done in that way, because we write on the practice that we do. But there are also practices that ideally we should do, but we can't do because land does not belong to government all the time, and land sometimes belongs to private holders. And private holders do not want to embrace certain things because it's about rent seeking as well, that you want to make the highest ROI on your development. So sometimes this happens because there is a contestation between those who, again, moral hazard, those who own the land and those who want to do or to further the common good or the public good in cities. So it's always going to be a contestation. So we should always have this debate in all these webinars.
So regarding architecture, I think in the context of PPRs, the issue with how architecture is being done, and one of it is at least that all the PPRs, the design, at least in KL, they're pretty much all the same, and it doesn't quite, they were not adapted to the specific environmental or geographic features of their area. So like from our survey, we noticed that one of the PPRs was even more dilapidated because of the building design, which literally is the same as the other PPRs, but this one was a bit worse because of the specific
building orientation.
Yeah, the building orientation, where I think it was to the rain, where it enters into the units and causes flooding. Yeah. But in terms of urban planning, I guess, yeah, this is definitely important, especially for the purpose of transportation and managing the transportation of the residents. So if there is proper planning, residents may not need a car, for example. So like for one of the PPRs that we surveyed, there was a nearby KTM station. At least nearby in the sense that, at least in the straight line distance, it seems nearby, but the hurdles that people would have to come across to actually walk from their PPRs and to the station is actually quite significant. So there definitely needs to be a bit more thought in terms of urban planning.
Can I just also take this time to promote our upcoming webinar in August, talking about residential settlements and spatial inequality? I think that will be discussed even more further in the next webinar. Next.
Okay, I'm a bit mindful of the time. We have about 5 minutes left until 11. So, and we have 6 open questions. So we will start prioritizing questions on what is most related to us, to our study. Perhaps let's answer that question. What is your proposal to overcome acute shortage of parking space in PPR? Is it even worse when schools are located near the area? And to make it worse, school buses seem extinct now. And number 2, from the attendees' observation, the build quality of PPR is generally unsatisfactory, especially in example in Kampung Medan and Subang. What policy can be introduced to overcome this issue?
A simple answer to the second part of the question is the recommendations that we have come up with, especially the management of PPR households, units. But in terms of the acute parking space, I guess the long-term objective is to improve public transport, so people would not have, they don't need more than one car or even one at all. But of course, this is a long-term thing. So in the short term, I think there is no easy solution. Perhaps this demand for parking must be met, because otherwise it might come at the risk of these residents who are poor and vulnerable. They may not be able to get to where they need to get to their jobs. So yeah, there's not quite an easy answer to that.
But can I just also add, so you have to remember that these PPR are actually built more than 20 years ago. So it's around like 2004, 2003 sort of PPRs. So when they were designed at that time, people weren't really, like the number of vehicles that you would tend to have per family is not as much as you would have now. So you can imagine it wasn't in the mind to build at that time to have like allocated parking spaces. That's one. Number 2, as Adam mentioned, so some PPRs that we surveyed, so even though they were located near public transports, it was still a hassle to go to a public transport. So for example, they still have to cross the highway. So you really have to like make sure your planning actually accounts for that. Thirdly, so I mean, we've seen some PPR who they actually built another building just to put additional parking spaces. So it can be done. It's sort of like a band-aid to a new arising solution, because it didn't come up at that time. But then again, yeah, you have multiple options, but I guess it means that in the future, when you design new PPRs, new social housings, this is definitely a thing that you need to consider.
Yeah, and also you brought up the fact that a lot of these residents are long-term renters, and the reason why we have that is because PPRs have been seen as a permanent solution for these families. But if we're able to move out of that mindset and ensure that they are able to graduate into the private market, then we might not have this issue about inadequate parking space, because initially when these families moved, perhaps it was just a couple, but eventually after many years, the family has grown. So that's why we have the number of cars have increased.
Okay, so maybe we'll move on to our final question. How will LCC solve the moral hazard issue between the federal and local authority? Who is going to pay for the maintenance costs under the LCC? Question number 1. And question number 2, would you be able to comment on Singapore's HDB public housing renewal programs? Can we emulate this for our PPR flats?
I can take the first question. So as I mentioned, when you do LCC, you try to estimate what is the cost needed for repairs and certain things, and you can imagine it for car ownership. Typically, car manufacturers would try to outline to you what's the scheduled maintenance like. You every few years or miles, you have to do an oil change, for example. So I think in the context of homeownership, something like that should be made available and transparent. And because of this, maybe once state governments know the true cost of maintenance, perhaps they would not bid or request from the federal government for PPRs, and maybe they would pressure the federal government to design better ones as well. And in terms of who is going to pay the maintenance cost, typically this would be mostly the local councils. But as I mentioned earlier, federal government could and should be injecting funds as well, because local councils, not all of them have enough funds.
And then I'll follow up. And I also like to add, so if the local councils know what is the actual maintenance cost needed for PPRs, then perhaps they can use that as a reference to set up a new rental fee. And then on the Singapore's HDB public housing renewal programs, for their early redevelopment program, so what they do is like they have a site where they will relocate the tenants to another site, and then the older flats will be demolished and used for other purposes, like for those who have potential for high redevelopment projects. And then there's also another program on neighborhood renewal program, where they target on the precinct and the building blocks related maintenance issues, or adding new facilities in that particular housing block. And can we emulate this for our PPR flats? So this again, we have to go back to LCC and also other building condition surveys to see whether our flats are, I will not say worth it, but it's cost effective for refurbishment or for demolition.
Can I add to just number 2? I know we're short of time. So the public housing in Singapore caters for both social and private, because they house more than 80% of the population, meaning there is no separation between the social and those who can afford, because it's just one major builder, which is the government, and supplier of homes. And it's not for, some are meant for renting, some are meant for ownership, but even ownership is only 99 years of lease. So the way in which HDB flats are conceived and managed is quite different, because they actually have a housing for all type of management, and therefore, in order to finance this type of development, they raise government bonds, because it's all assets of the government. So they don't mind investing in the physical built form, because this is seen as investment for the country. So it's a totally different mindset, and they raise government bonds. So I wanted to say that, because we had a chat with the HDB authorities before, because we also wanted to learn. It's always good to learn from each other's country's experience. So it does take up a lot of funds, because it's for everybody. Now, if they were just to do for social housing, if we can get our act together in Malaysia, maybe people can come and see us after this. But yeah, that's it.
Okay, I guess it is time to conclude. It is about 11:02 right now. We apologize for not being able to answer all your questions, but rest assured that we do read them, and we do value your questions as part of this longer term discussion that we are all part of in terms of bettering the common good. We would like to thank you for taking the time to attend our webinar, for asking these questions, and for wanting to be part of this discussion in general. If you have enjoyed this discussion, we'd like to invite you to follow us on our social media. We intend to have another webinar in sometime between 15 or 17 of August next month, dealing with more housing and urban development. So until we meet again, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.